Forget Bellingcat. Meet a real open-source watchdog. Jack Paulson has an insider's background, an outsider's perspective, and unique technical expertise, making him an invaluable resource for monitoring the world of national security contracting. On September 11th of this year, on the third floor of the Nauticus Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, defense and intelligence representatives gathered for the first and only unclassified meeting of a Naval Special Warfare Command technology integration exercise called Trident Specter 2024. What is Trident? The 3-minute video above was unveiled for attendees. It pitched the program as a matchmaking forum for contractors and defense leaders who tour the experimentation camp during the exercise, leading to technology transition or outright acquisition, the contract-hungry crowd was told, in tantalizing narration. Our ultimate goal, the Trident video summed up, is to shorten the acquisition kill chain and enable the special operations warriors of the future. What's an acquisition kill chain? You likely wouldn't get an answer to that question either from industry visitors or the defense leaders present clutching strings to very heavy purses. There was, however, one person in attendance who could explain to the public who was there and why. The founder of a pair of websites, techinquiry.org, and Substack's All Source Intelligence Fusion, Jack Paulson has a PhD in applied mathematics, is a former researcher for Stanford and Google, and has a backstory that makes him uniquely qualified to keep track of defense contractors and pass on information like he just published, like a list of 188 industry attendees to Trident Specter. The backstory he'll explain in his own words below. First, an introduction to what his sites do. Both Tech Inquiry and All Source Intelligence Fusion employ Paulson's designs for combining open source information with leaks, disclosures in books and memoirs, and other esoteric data. In addition to going events like Trident Specter to gather information in person, Paulson builds interactive maps and search engines allowing civilians to identify things like contracting relationships. A typical all-source intelligence fusion article from a week ago published information about the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency's program for identifying inside threats, i.e., whistleblowers. He also does the electronic version of undercover work, posing, for instance, as a customer to be pitched the chat room surveillance methods of a federal law enforcement contractor. Paulson identifies companies like Flashpoint that do surveillance work and shows examples of how groups across the political spectrum, from anti-pipeline protesters to groups opposed to vaccine mandates, are being infiltrated and investigated by firms with long-standing ties to enforcement arms. He follows these actors closely. In a report after the public outing of so-called Pentagon leaker Jack Teixeira, for instance, he reminded readers that Flashpoint boasted as recently as last November that it was the best tool for Bellingcat, the would-be citizen journalist organization that worked with the New York Times to out Teixeira. The same release noted Bellingcat trained 20 journalists from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, in the use of Flashpoint's EchoSec technology, which they said was useful for investigating the lives of children of corrupt officials, among other things. Bellingcat claimed its relationship with Flashpoint ended in 2015, saying it was insanely expensive, but EchoSec wasn't acquired by Flashpoint until 2022, so something about this picture is incongruous. Still, these associations likely wouldn't have been made at all, without someone keeping tabs on the relevant players. When he's not following surveillance contractors, Paulson is building tools unlike anything found in the popular press, like an interactive map of U.S. embassies, naval bases, FBI field offices, ICE Aero HSI offices, all DEA regional division offices, and Border Patrol sectors offices that allows users to click on any icon and access the site's data feed of procurement records and/or historical diplomatic cables associated with a particular location. If Bellingcat is a quasi-partner of industry and the defense and intelligence communities in monitoring threats in the general public, Paulson's sites represent a nearly opposite approach. He keeps eyes on the same issues, but big distinction exists in that he doesn't use any intrusive surveillance software like facial recognition, and doesn't partner with national security agencies or contractors. Journalists who work in the national security space who aren't aware of Paulson's work would do well to take regular looks at his reports, and to get into the habit of using his databases as resources, as they offer unique context for investigations of secretive entities. The most interesting part about his ventures, however, is the reason they came into being. Paulson answered a few questions for Racket about this, and about his recent visit to Norfolk. Taibbi, what's the best way to describe your background for readers who may not be familiar with the kind of work you've done over the years? Paulson, I finished my PhD in computational applied math just before the Snowden revelations broke. I had just been thrown into contracting with DARPA on data analytics while transitioning into stints as an assistant professor at Georgia Tech and then Stanford. I quickly learned that my DARPA program manager wasn't interested in any serious discussion of the ethics of mass surveillance, and he was later given a puff profile by 60 Minutes for funding tools for surveilling users of the anonymity platform Tor. Beyond concerns over my complicity in government surveillance, I preferred spending most of my time writing open source software and preferred to only edit or submit to open access journals, which was starting to generate pushback from my colleagues. At the same time, deep learning was swallowing up research funding in my field, which historically focused on physics simulation and advanced mathematics rather than processing text or labeling images. So I moved across the street from Stanford to Google Research to apply my numerical analysis expertise towards developing custom recommender systems. 2 years later, news broke on both Google's secretive involvement in the Pentagon's artificial intelligence drone surveillance program, Project Maven, as well as its construction of a version of its eponymous search engine that was tailored to the Chinese government's censorship and surveillance demands, Project Dragonfly. Through access to internal source code, it became apparent within the company that the search phrase human rights was on a potential censorship list, but management refused to clarify. Through a conditional resignation letter, I fought my way up to a one-on-one meeting with the head of Google's AI, Jeff Dean, who didn't dispute that the company might turn over information on Chinese citizens who searched for the phrase human rights. He argued that, for all I knew, Google was already providing that information to the U.S. government through Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants, FISA. I resigned the next day and reached out to a journalist about a week later to tell the story. I'd never spoken to a journalist before, and I was completely unprepared for the resulting frenzy, which I mostly ducked due to living in Canada at the time and not owning a smartphone. Taibbi, what are tech inquiry and all-source intelligence fusion? Paulson, Tech Inquiry's current main project is to reverse engineer government contracting feeds for every U.S. military installation around the world, then tie them together through their relationship with their associated military units and weapons and surveillance systems. The goal is to produce both map-based and graph-based interfaces for exploring them. We have built a similar system for monitoring the purchasing of every U.S. embassy around the world, alongside annotated copies of each embassy's associated leaked diplomatic cables. We are also on our way towards annotating each embassy with the publicly reported tenures of their CIA station chiefs and diplomats. More broadly, the nonprofit provides, ideally daily updated, public access to annotated versions of government contracting records across more than 30 countries, spanning the so-called Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Alliance, the European Union, and, to the degree that it is possible, Israel. About 5 months ago, I began separately publishing my independent journalism through my Substack, All Source Intelligence Fusion. Perhaps as a result of overcorrecting from my previous experiences in advocacy, and the ease with which anyone investigating U.S. intelligence agencies is discredited as a conspiracist. I prefer my journalism to be as understated and fact-driven as possible, with the style of a Reuters Wire article being a rough North Star, but with a pointed focus on the surveillance industry supporting U.S. intelligence agencies and perhaps more aggressive reporting methodology. Taibbi, what do these sites cover, and why did you start doing this? Paulson, in 2019 I was invited to what was referred to as a Track 2 discussion at Stanford's Hoover Institution, semi-officially to be questioned by numerous high-level U.S. military and intelligence officials, including a 4-star general, on why I thought tech workers had a right to not contribute to military surveillance or weapons systems. The meeting was under Chatham House rules, but suffice it to say I immediately began submitting numerous Freedom of Information requests for contracts between U.S. defense contractors and the myriad defense innovation organizations set up by the Pentagon, as part of their efforts to incorporate artificial intelligence into their weapons and surveillance systems. I was also beginning to build a nonprofit for carefully supporting rank-and-file tech workers who were compelled to speak out on human rights issues relating to the militarization of U.S. companies and their complicity in government censorship around the world. Over time, I learned how naive I had been, on multiple fronts. 1. Largely due to narratives encouraging the need for more content moderation, prominent tech whistleblowers became increasingly friendly with the U.S. spy agencies. On a whistleblowing panel hosted by my close colleagues, former CIA senior intelligence officer turned Facebook whistleblower Yael Eisenstadt promoted the CIA as a place that speaks truth to power. And both Eisenstadt and fellow Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen joined a formal council with former CIA directors Leanne Panetta and Porter Goss, as well as former NSA director Michael Rogers. Well-funded nonprofits, which are supportive of these narratives, now largely dominate the tech whistleblowing side of U.S. civil society. 2. Through reading U.S. diplomatic cables published by WikiLeaks, I learned that at least 2 of the small human rights organizations I worked with had a history of secretly informing to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And even the more radical groups insisted that our collaborations be funded by U.S. billionaires, particularly Pierre Omidyar. More broadly, I found that the discussion about the interplay between U.S. corporations and the Chinese government were so propagandized and selectively filtered or amplified by U.S. media and politicians that speaking out on the subject felt more destructive than helpful. 3. Just as I completed a year-long project mapping out contracts between U.S. cloud computing giants and governments around the world, both of the funders demanded censorship of inconvenient findings. The International Labor Training Affiliate of the Communications Workers of America, CWA, demanded that I remove all discussion of Microsoft's military and intelligence contracts because CWA had recently signed a labor neutrality deal with the company. And the Foundation for the German Social Democratic Party, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, made it known that both their DC and Israel offices demanded that I remove all discussion of Google and Amazon's billion-dollar Nimbus cloud contract supporting the Israel Defense Fund. As a result of me making these censorship demands public, my board member from the labor community angrily resigned and now works in partnership with the CWA. Long story short, as someone who wants to expose intelligence agencies and billionaires rather than become friends with them, I shifted into work that I could do on a shoestring budget, particularly analyzing international government contracting records to guide investigative reporting on the broader all-source intelligence context of Project Maven. One of my major interests has become how the two narratives of counter-disinformation and counter-human trafficking are used as the primary public justifications for the social media surveillance, cell phone location tracking, facial recognition, and modernized human intelligence industries which cropped up during the global war on terror, and then amplified as the U.S. shifted into great power competition with China. Some of the findings I've been most proud of depended on whistleblowers, but there isn't enough appreciation for what can be gleaned from carefully analyzing what governments and companies already make public. This was essentially the thesis of legendary outsider investigative journalist I.F. Stone. Beyond using public records analysis to guide hundreds of Freedom of Information requests each year, it can also inform which surveillance industry conferences are most useful to attend, discreetly when necessary. I was shocked to learn this morning that my investigation into the U.S. cell phone location tracking firm Anomaly 6 last year is being cited today by the Chinese Ministry of State Security as part of their newly published report on U.S. intelligence agency surveillance. Being comfortable with both being directly cited by Chinese intelligence and with blowing the whistle on secret surveillance agreements between U.S. tech companies and the Chinese government is perhaps representative of the scope of my commitment to objective reporting. Taibbi, what is Trident Specter? Paulson. After September 11th, the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. government's elite counterterrorism unit, Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, were the first to invade Afghanistan. The two most famous components of JSOC are the U.S. Army's Delta Force, which Chuck Norris famously portrayed in his 1986 movie of the same name, and the Navy's SEAL Team 6, which famously invaded Pakistan on May 2, 2011, using stealth helicopters and executed Osama bin Laden. Especially in the early days in Afghanistan, SEAL Team 6 was seen as the little brother to the more secretive Delta Force. But JSOC Commander Del Daly began placing SEAL Team 6 in charge in Afghanistan as early as January 2002, partly to conserve Delta for what was certain to be a long war. After the US began prioritizing Iraq surrounding its 2003 invasion, SEAL Team 6's role in Afghanistan only solidified. One of the main challenges for Team 6 at the time was precisely locating its high-value targets, which were primarily members of Al-Qaeda. They realized that much of the surveillance technology and data that they wanted to use was available for sale from companies, but thought the Pentagon's contracting bureaucracy was too slow for it to help. Trident Specter claims to have been developed in 2005 by such tactical operators within Naval Special Warfare Command, the parent organization for all Navy SEALs and the more specialized SEAL Team 6, to shorten the acquisition kill chain. That is, to accelerate the purchase of weapons and surveillance to kill people more quickly. JSOC has a long history of tracking cell phones, though the techniques have evolved over time from primarily direction finding on radio emissions, which is how one of their special missions units famously caught Pablo Escobar, into a worldwide surveillance network of cell phone GPS locations fueled by quasi-legally hoovering up information available to advertisers and app developers. And, as the global war on terror morphed into great power competition with China and Russia, the same cell phone surveillance companies continued working with Trident Specter, albeit on tracking Russian and Chinese troop movements, often in concert with monitoring their social media accounts. The three most infamous commercial cell phone location tracking companies that I published as having attended Trident Specter last week were Babel Street, Anomaly 6, and OutLogic, which was caught surveilling the locations of users of a popular Muslim prayer application, Muslim Pro, before rebranding away from its old name, Xmode Social. Taibbi. A lot of the companies you mentioned got their start as contractors during the War on Terror. How much crossover is there between the War on Terror and the anti-disinformation era in terms of defense on security contracting? Paulson. Far more than most people realize. JSOC's adoption of commercial surveillance technologies not only included cell phone location tracking, but also tools for surveilling social media. Many readers will have heard of open source intelligence, or OSINT, though, depending upon subtle details and who is talking, it is also referred to as the use of publicly available information, PAI. Think of the types of techniques that Bellingcat is famous for, but practiced by JSOC to figure out who to execute. The first article that I published on my Substack, which I was told by more than one person should have been edited down further, reported on a series of ongoing worldwide tactical information warfare contracts between U.S. Special Operations Forces, including JSOC, with a little-known surveillance firm known as 26 Technologies, which was born out of a DARPA project run out of a tiki bar outside of Jalalabad, Afghanistan, in 2010. Through a community which infamously promoted itself as an informal offshoot of Burning Man, the idea was to modernize military human intelligence networks from Cold War-era radio broadcasts into the era of smartphones, and to use the trusted networks formed through hacker communities and U.S. aid distribution to bootstrap it. While publicly advertised as focused on countering disinformation, when I got copies of the actual contracts through Freedom of Information requests, I found that the U.S. military internally described the nominal counter-disinformation work as tactical information warfare, fueled by the combination of social media surveillance and cell phone location tracking. In practice, this means helping U.S. Special Operations Forces, ranging from JSOC to Army Green Berets and their civilian affairs and psychological operations partners, in both identifying informants and developing local narratives which will turn citizens against U.S. adversaries, such as China. More broadly, one can easily find public contracting summaries describing the development of anti-Chinese propaganda from both the cell phone location tracking data broker SafeGraph and the social media surveillance company Graphica. To put it simply, U.S. Special Operations Forces have always heavily depended upon conducting surveillance to build up informant networks and to conduct, hopefully, effective propaganda campaigns. But they can now reframe their offensive infrastructure as defensive by emphasizing the need for boots-on-the-ground reporting to counter Russian and Chinese disinformation. We know from direct copies of contracts that this includes large-scale social media surveillance, cell phone location tracking, and the development of informant networks through custom software and hardware for spamming text messages, known as the Pulse platform. To some degree, the surveillance angles aren't even hidden. The former head of all CIA spying operations, Elizabeth Kimber, became a vice president at 26 Technologies, the primary contractor for this global spying network. And former NSA Director Mike McConnell, who was also George W. Bush's Director of National Intelligence for 2 years, is a board member and advocate. The most widely and thoroughly exposed company in this space is Primus Data, a gig-work surveillance analog of 26 Technologies, which I have extensively reported on in the past few months on my Substack. As far back as June 2021, the Wall Street Journal exposed Primus's covert intelligence work by publishing an internal slide deck pitching the company as a dynamically retaskable global platform to help the U.S. military, including Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan, to conduct information operations, I.O., as well as collecting signals intelligence, SIGINT, and human intelligence, HUMINT. But unlike 26, they would build their network by behaving more like Uber than a PR agency. One of the company's employees allegedly blew the whistle to one of Primus's major aid clients, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and is still defending himself against Primus in a lawsuit the company initiated against him more than 4 years ago. Perhaps the other two major counter-disinformation intelligence contractors born out of the global war on terror are Babel Street and Flashpoint. While Babel is most infamous for its commercial cell phone location tracking product, LocateX, it got its start in standardizing the translation of Arabic names into English as part of the global war on terror. Both LocateX and its social media surveillance product, BabelX, are in active use by militaries and intelligence agencies around the world. In fact, during the Trident Specter Industry Day last Monday, Babel employee Zachary Dimmer asked what his company could do to request SEAL Team 6 as a partner, whereas Flashpoint began as the online analog of a group of anti-Muslim extremists who would covertly infiltrate community events. Flashpoint's insight was that it was much more scalable and profitable to infiltrate chat rooms than in-person events, and that the FBI was an eager partner. In fact, Flashpoint's surveillance platform is listed as a component of the global counter-disinformation effort run by 26. Taibbi, explain the Reese's Pieces and Viagra metaphors that popped up at the Norfolk event. Paulson, Trident Specter is run through a sort of private LinkedIn for contractors with U.S. Special Operations, known as Vulcan. And the major theme is building teams that creatively combine technologies from different companies. One of the more revealing examples of this, which was perhaps accidentally revealed as a part of a tech demo, was a past year's Trident Specter effort to identify ships that turned off their location beacons, known as the Automatic Identification System, AIS, which is essentially just GPS for boats. The idea was to combine the Proteus AIS data feed maintained by the Naval Research Laboratory with cell phone location tracking data sourced from advertising data streams in order to detect AIS manipulations. One obvious approach would be to look for cases where a phone's GPS location matched that of a boat's AIS signal. Then to look for instances where the two diverged in the middle of the ocean. In the lingo of Trident Specter, this is combining AIS chocolate with cell phone location tracking peanut butter to make Reese's Pieces. The next year, an analogous combination was tested using satellite-based commercial synthetic aperture radar instead of cell phone location tracking data. But the meeting closed with what one host referred to as the moment of the meeting. As part of explaining the types of technologies that Naval Special Warfare Command was looking for, a female staffer explained that what she was really looking for was Viagra. That is, approaches whose unintended side effects turn out to be more interesting than the original goal. In the case of Viagra, Pfizer had been searching for a cure for chest pain. Thanks for listening to the audio version of this article. For more, visit racket.news.